Driver 2, well known for being one of the most challenging driving games for a number of years now. As soon as I saw this game, I was intrigued by it. Not just because it's an old PlayStation game, which is what this channel is known for now, I guess, but because I think it represents an interesting look of the right tech being used for the wrong objective. And by no means I mean this is a bad thing. The game is quite diverse for its time and encapsulated that transition point of 90s to 2000s rather well as something for younger people like myself to look back on, despite the game taking place in the early 80s. However, to get to all this, we have to go back to the start of development. The year is 1999 and Reflections Interactive seem to have struck gold with their original title and first 3D game, Driver, for the PlayStation 1 and PC. A vastly different experience from most of the arcade track-focused races of the time. Interestingly, I don't think Driver 1 was appealing to me personally as Driver 2. With the cool but somewhat vacant cutscenes and damn long story for a PS1 game. Before this, Reflections were sort of indie studio with a few successful 2D platformers, but Driver seemed to catch on with gamers alike, selling over 6.5 million copies. Naturally, when they were bought out, the higher-ups wanted a sequel as soon as possible. The pressure was on for the team, but they got to work and within a year released Driver 2, except it was still on the PlayStation 1. The PlayStation 2 had already been released a month prior. Okay, so it's not a huge deal, and most people probably still had their PS1s and wanted games on them just like last-gen consoles nowadays. However, the game needed 2 discs to compile the 4 maps and story FMVs. If you don't know what an FMV is, it's essentially how they did cutscenes back in the day, rendering them outside of the game, usually looking much better than the actual gameplay. And you can definitely tell from an FMV if the game's from the 90s or at least the first half of the early 2000s. Although they hadn't gone Driver 3 and hired celebrity voice actors yet, the dialogue and interactions between characters does seem more natural than in the first game.
Where you going, Tanner?
I got
Didn't you hear none of that in there? We're going now, baby.
He was feeling the pain. My handgun settled in between his eyes. I let him chew on a piece of my food.
And the story was really the main thing keeping me playing this game. As much like other games of the period, like the Getaway series and arguably Grand Theft Auto, it feels like you're playing a movie. To accompany them this time, they went with a licensed soundtrack, alongside the game's original score, which was already clearly inspired by many hours of films. They also took the brave choice to not just have the game set in the United States, but Havana and Rio de Janeiro. And they went into detail with these cities too, even having each one with dialogue. The police and characters be in the languages they would actually speak. The addition of these cities gave a much greater sense of diversity through the story than the first Driver, where everything seemed similarly in the American blocky ruler design. And now you only got a few preview of something to suggest otherwise, the small map rendition of Newcastle and its pubs in the credits, although it could only be accessed with cheats and was really made as a cool little Easter egg for the fans. It's clear, though, that Driver 2 has a very ambitious game with a big scope at the time. So much so that often the PS1 hardware couldn't handle it with FPS drops, lag, and sometimes even outright crash. The footage you are seeing on your crisp modern screen is a fan-made PC port which addresses most of these issues and makes the game both more fun and sometimes less frustrating, including that damn gunman chase mission. It's honestly tragic that it wasn't made as a PS2 title, or at least a part of the game, to PlayStation and PC, which I'm sure gamers at the time would have appreciated. Could you imagine what Driver 2 would be like if it had similar graphics and detail to something like Gran Turismo 3? At least the transition from cutscene to gameplay wouldn't be as jarring anymore. But no, the only other version of the game was on the Game Boy Advance, which was good considering its limitations, but not exactly the ultimate gaming experience. Following all this, the game would still sell around 4 million copies, which wasn't bad, but gamers had caught on, and sadly it didn't receive all the praise the original had, with a big factor being the issues mentioned before, and the hard nature of the game, especially that damn gunman chase mission! All in all, though, the story of the game makes up for these elements and would set the seed for Driver 3, and somewhat Driver San Francisco to continue on with quite a few memorable characters, even though if you're experienced with the game, it shouldn't take you more than a handful of hours to complete, provided you don't smash the controller. In the end, though, while Driver 2 is a great game to a cult following of people, you can't help but feel it could have been better had it not just had unfortunate circumstances. I think it would sell a lot more fondly looked up on, possibly by more people. It was a great concept with an unlucky execution, a theme which had plagued the entire series until San Francisco. In conclusion, though, while I do think it definitely has its flaws, there are reasons to go back and revisit it. I mean, the world is still rather large for its time, and while the graphics aren't exactly pretty, they're not the worst thing in the world. And I guess with that, this will be Eureka Dude signing off.
Yeah, yeah, oh yeah, what condition my condition was in.